Anthony Scotto. Anthony Michael Scotto, May 10, 1934, August 21, 2021, was an American labor union leader who rose from longshoreman on the Brooklyn docks to become president of International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, Local 1814, and executive vice president of the ILA's Atlantic Coast District. 1. Born into a family of dockworkers in Brooklyn, New York, Scotto began working on the waterfront at age 16 and quickly ascended union ranks, positioning himself as a reformer amid efforts to purge organized crime influence from the industry. 1. 2. Scotto wielded significant political influence in New York, cultivating relationships with Democratic figures including Presidents Lyndon B. Johnson and John F. Kennedy, as well as Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and was known for mobilizing union support in elections. 3. His career, however, was overshadowed by allegations of ties to the Gambino crime family, where he was reputed to serve as a caporegime overseeing waterfront rackets. 4. 5. In 1979, Scotto was convicted on federal charges of labor racketeering, conspiracy, and receiving over $300,000 in illegal kickbacks from companies for labor peace, alongside ILA official Frank Blue Eyes Anastasio. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison in 1980 and fined $75,000, serving about 3 years before release. 6. 4 to 7. After prison, Scotto transitioned to philanthropy and business consulting, maintaining a lower profile while his daughter, Rosanna Scotto, became a prominent television news anchor. 1. 3. His dual legacy, as a charismatic union power broker credited with improving worker conditions and a convicted extortionist emblematic of persistent waterfront corruption, reflects the complex interplay of labor activism and organized crime in mid-20th century New York. 8. Early life and family. Birth and upbringing in Brooklyn. Anthony Michael Scotto was born on May 10, 1934, in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn, New York. 9. He grew up in the working-class neighborhoods of Red Hook and Carroll Gardens, areas known for their proximity to the waterfront and heavy involvement in maritime labor. 5. 10. As the son and grandson of dock workers, Scotto was immersed from an early age in the culture of Brooklyn's longshoremen, though his father worked as a sanitation department employee for the city of New York. 9. 1. Scotto attended St. Francis Preparatory School in Brooklyn, graduating from the institution before pursuing higher education. 1. 10. He enrolled at Brooklyn College to study pre-law and political science but left after 2 years without completing a degree. 3. At age 16, during his teenage years, Scotto began working as a longshoreman on the Brooklyn docks, gaining first-hand experience in the physically demanding and often volatile environment of waterfront labor. 5. This early entry into the workforce reflected the economic realities of his upbringing in a community where many young men from Italian-American families transitioned quickly from school to manual jobs amid limited formal opportunities. 1. Parental influence and initial labor exposure. Anthony Scotto was born on May 10, 1934, in Brooklyn, New York, to parents whose lives were centered on the waterfront labor economy. His father and maternal grandfather both worked as longshoremen on the Brooklyn docks, embedding the family in the demanding and often perilous world of manual dock work. 1. This generational involvement in the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, shaped Scotto's early worldview, with his family's experiences, highlighting the physical toll of loading and unloading cargo amid rudimentary safety standards and shape-up hiring systems prevalent in the 1930s and 1940s. 1. 4. Raised in the working-class neighborhoods of Red Hook and Carroll Gardens, Scotto's upbringing immersed him in a community where labor solidarity was both a survival mechanism and a pathway to modest economic stability, influenced by his parents' narratives of strikes, employer resistance, and the nascent power of union representation on the piers. 511. His initial direct exposure to this labor environment came at age 16 in 1950, when he began working as a longshoreman on the Brooklyn waterfront, performing the grueling tasks of manual cargo handling that his forebears had endured for decades. 5.4. This entry-level role provided first-hand insight into the inefficiencies of pre-containerization operations, including intermittent employment and exposure to hazardous conditions without modern equipment. 11. Union career beginnings. Entry as longshoreman. Anthony Scotto began his career on the Brooklyn waterfront at age 16 in 1950, taking up work as a longshoreman loading and unloading ships in the Red Hook and Carroll Gardens areas. 5.11. This entry into the physically demanding profession marked his initial immersion in the labor-intensive operations of the port, where workers handled bulk cargo amid hazardous conditions typical of mid-20th century dock work. 1. As a young longshoreman affiliated with the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, Scotto gained first-hand experience in the union's shape-up system for daily job assignments, a practice that often favored seniority and connections on the piers. 8. His early tenure coincided with a period of waterfront modernization challenges, including the gradual shift from breakbulk to containerized shipping, though his initial role focused on manual labor rather than leadership. 1. By engaging in this entry-level position, Scotto positioned himself within Local 1814's membership base, setting the foundation for his subsequent ascent in union activities. 5. Leadership of ILA Local 1814. Scotto assumed the presidency of International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, Local 1814 in Brooklyn in 1963, succeeding Anthony Anastasio following the latter's death on March 1 of that year. 1. At age 29, he led a local representing approximately 9,000 members, the largest and most influential unit in the ILA along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. 1. Local 1814 controlled key Brooklyn waterfront operations, handling significant cargo volumes amid the industry's shift toward containerization. Upon taking office, Scotto pledged to curb dockside pilfering and extortion, practices that had plagued the piers under prior leadership. 1. He emphasized collaborative bargaining over confrontation, advocating for negotiations between reasonable men on both sides of the table, as stated in a 1965 address. 1. This approach aimed to stabilize labor relations with waterfront employers while protecting worker interests. Scotto's tenure addressed entrenched racial barriers on the Brooklyn docks, where discrimination had historically excluded black workers from stable employment. He spearheaded integration efforts, implementing a union hiring system that promoted fairer access for minorities. In a 1966 report to Local 1814's roughly 8,000 members, Scotto highlighted how racial bias impeded the broader ILA's effectiveness, signaling an internal push against discriminatory practices. 12. Under Scotto's direction through the 1970s, Local 1814 maintained its dominance in Brooklyn, navigating tensions from technological changes and port competition while securing member benefits amid economic pressures. 13. His leadership positioned the Local as a powerhouse, influencing regional waterfront dynamics until federal scrutiny intensified in the late 1970s. 13. Rise to prominence in the ILA, vice presidency and national role. Scotto ascended to the vice presidency of the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, shortly after becoming president of Local 1814 in Brooklyn in 1963. 14. In this international role, he pushed for internal reforms, including a 1966 report criticizing racial segregation within the ILA as a barrier to the union's advancement. 12. He also advocated shifting from confrontational tactics to cordial negotiations in 1965, aiming to curb waterfront issues such as pilfering and extortion. From 1975 to 1979, Scotto held the position of Vice President for Legislative Affairs at the national level for the ILA, concurrent with his local presidency. 13. This role involved representing the union in broader legislative and policy matters affecting dockworkers across the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. 1. He participated in national contract discussions, earning recognition for securing a guaranteed annual wage and other benefits that elevated worker compensation. 15. As a member of the ILA's Council on Port Development and Promotion, Scotto contributed to modernizing port infrastructure and drawing millions in new shipping business to New York facilities. 14. His prominence fueled speculation about his potential to succeed ILA President Thomas W. Gleason, with 1,971 union discussions centering on Scotto as a leading candidate due to his influence over the organization's largest local. 16. These efforts solidified his status as a pivotal national figure in waterfront labor dynamics until federal indictments curtailed his activities in 1979. 15. Key negotiations on automation and containerization. In the mid-1960s, the advent of containerization revolutionized maritime shipping by enabling faster loading and unloading, but it threatened mass job losses among longshoremen as fewer workers were needed to handle cargo. The International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, under leaders including Vice President Anthony Scotto, responded by negotiating restrictions and compensatory mechanisms in collective bargaining agreements to preserve employment and secure benefits. Scotto, as president of ILA Local 1814, the largest local in Brooklyn, played a pivotal role in advocating for these measures, leveraging local referendums and legal precedents to pressure shippers and pier operators. 17. A key initiative under Scotto's leadership occurred in May 1967, when Local 1814 invoked a recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling on prefabricated cargo to challenge containers pre-loaded outside ILA ports, arguing they constituted unauthorized prefabrication work that bypassed union jurisdiction. Scotto announced plans to enforce limits requiring that containers arriving sealed from foreign origins be unpacked by ILA members if they contained less than a full load equivalent to one longshoreman's daily work, aiming to reclaim jurisdiction over an estimated 20 to 30% of cargo volume shifting to containers. This strategy sought to slow automation's encroachment while negotiating royalties from shippers to fund worker displacement. Later that year, in November 1967, Local 1814 held a referendum where 90% of members favored direct cash payments into a containerization fund rather than employer contributions to pension plans, reflecting Scotto's push for immediate financial safeguards amid fears of workforce reduction from 25,000 to under 10,000 jobs in New York by the 1970s. 17. By March 1968, as national ILA contract talks intensified, Scotto demanded concessions from Brooklyn pier operators to offset automation, including guaranteed work minimums and expanded jurisdiction over container handling, warning that without them, the waterfront faced irreparable damage from technological displacement. These efforts contributed to broader ILA agreements, such as the establishment of a Guaranteed Annual Income (GAI) program in the 1960s, which provided partial wage replacement for laid-off workers, and container royalties paid by shippers, typically $0.25 to $3 per ton, to a fund compensating for productivity gains that have labor needs per ship. Scotto's negotiations emphasized job security over outright bans, acknowledging containerization's inevitability while extracting employer-funded benefits estimated at millions annually for the ILA's Atlantic Coast locals. 2018, during the 1977 East Coast dock strike, which halted ports for over 7 weeks over automation clauses, Scotto reiterated the union's strategic pivot. Unable to halt containerization and related technologies like computerized cranes, the ILA focused on sharing productivity benefits through higher wages, pensions, and job protections, securing a 30% wage increase and extended GAI in the final pact. His stance drew internal criticism from rank-and-file militants who viewed such compromises as insufficient against automation's long-term erosion of employment, but it aligned with the ILA's pragmatic approach, stabilizing the industry while funding welfare programs that sustained thousands of families. These negotiations under Scotto's influence marked a transition from resistance to managed adaptation, preserving union density on the waterfront into the 1980s despite ongoing technological pressures. 22. Achievements in labor representation. Improvements in worker wages and benefits. Under Anthony Scotto's leadership as president of International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, Local 1814 starting in 1963, Brooklyn waterfront longshoremen experienced significant wage gains, with hourly rates reaching $10.40 by 1979. A marked increase from the $4 to $5 per hour that workers estimated would have prevailed without his efforts. 23. These improvements stemmed from aggressive contract negotiations amid rising containerization and port mechanization, which Scotto leveraged to secure higher base pay scales for the locals over 2,000 members. 23. Scotto was instrumental in establishing and expanding a guaranteed annual income (GAI) for ILA members on the New York and New Jersey piers, providing income stability equivalent to full-year employment even during work slowdowns or seasonal lulls. 24. By 1966, the GAI offered approximately $5,500 annually based on 1,600 hours of work, evolving into a more robust system by 1979 that delivered $21,632 per year to senior dock workers regardless of actual hours logged. 23. This mechanism, won through strikes and bargaining, addressed chronic underemployment. On the waterfront, where irregular workloads had previously left workers vulnerable to poverty. 24. Benefits under Local 1814 also advanced, including the construction of a free dental and medical clinic serving members and their families, funded through welfare contributions from employers. 23. These enhancements, alongside the GAI, elevated the profession's economic security and professional standing, as noted by rank-and-file members who credited Scotto with transforming precarious dock labor into a viable career path. 23. Modernization of waterfront operations. Under Scotto's presidency of ILA Local 1814 starting in 1963, the union confronted the disruptive effects of containerization and automation on Brooklyn waterfront employment, which shifted cargo handling from labor-intensive break-bulk methods to mechanized container operations, reducing the need for traditional longshore gangs. 20. In March 1968, Scotto publicly demanded operational concessions from peer employers, arguing that existing agreements failed to adequately offset job losses from automated equipment like container cranes and arguing that the 1960 arbitration-based container royalty system, intended to compensate workers for work shifted outside ports, was obsolete and insufficient. 20. These royalties, paid by shippers on container loads to fund union benefits, became a core strategy for sustaining membership amid technological displacement, with Scotto supporting a 1967 referendum where 90% of members favored direct cash distributions from such funds. 19. Scotto extended these efforts nationally as ILA vice president, insisting in 1969 on strict enforcement of container royalty collections in Philadelphia locals to prevent erosion of funds for displaced workers. 26. By October 1976, he helped Negotiate a supplemental accord with the New York Shipping Association specifying longshoreman roles in stuffing, stripping, and handling containerized goods at piers, aiming to preserve jurisdictional work amid ongoing mechanization. 27. Unable to halt automation entirely, these initiatives prioritized financial safeguards over resistance, channeling royalties into welfare funds that supported pensions and health benefits for a shrinking workforce. 22. Beyond negotiations, Scotto promoted physical and infrastructural renewal of the aging Brooklyn waterfront to enhance efficiency and competitiveness, including advocacy for pier upgrades compatible with container traffic during the 1970s decline of traditional docks. 1. He oversaw the Anthony J. Anastasio Medical Clinic, established in the late 1960s near Red Hook docks to provide care for members affected by reduced workloads from containerization, and directed a union foundation offering scholarships to longshore families, fostering adaptation through education in an era of job transition. 1. These measures reflected a pragmatic response to causal shifts in global shipping, prioritizing member security over outdated practices while navigating tensions between preservation of union control and operational evolution. 14. Political engagements. Alliances with Democratic leaders. Scotto cultivated extensive alliances with prominent Democratic figures in New York and nationally, leveraging his position as a labor leader to provide financial support, endorsements, and campaign assistance. In 1972, he was selected as a New York delegate to the Democratic National Convention but withdrew in protest over the Credentials Committee's decisions, reflecting his active role in party politics. By 1976, both Scotto and his wife Marion served as delegates to the convention supporting Jimmy Carter's presidential bid, during which Scotto hosted a rally for Carter in Brooklyn less than a week before the election and reportedly donated $50,000 to the campaign. 28. 29. His relationship with New York Governor Hugh Carey, 1975-1982, was particularly close, involving discussions on political appointments and labor matters. Carey testified as a character witness during Scotto's 1979 racketeering trial, describing him as trustworthy and affirming their collaborative history, including Scotto's contributions to Carey's successful 1978 re-election campaign, which involved $75,000 in cash donations as Scotto later testified. 30. 28-3. Scotto also supported Mario Cuomo's 1977 mayoral campaign in New York City, channeling $50,000 in cash through intermediaries like Anthony Anastasio and Louis Valentino, a Cuomo campaign official as revealed in trial testimony. These ties extended to earlier Democratic leaders, including Lyndon B. Johnson and Robert F. Kennedy, with whom Scotto maintained connections through union advocacy. President Carter reportedly considered Scotto for U.S. Secretary of Labor, highlighting his perceived influence in labor circles prior to federal investigations. 28. 31. 29. 3. Influence on policy and elections. Scotto wielded considerable influence in New York Democratic politics as a prolific fundraiser and endorser of candidates, leveraging his union leadership to mobilize resources and voters on the waterfront. In 1976, he hosted a rally for Jimmy Carter in Brooklyn less than a week before the presidential election and accompanied Carter on campaign tours in the area, contributing to Carter's narrow victory in New York State, which carried 41 electoral votes. He testified in 1979 to delivering $75,000 in cash contributions to support Governor Hugh Carey's re-election and Mario Cuomo's campaigns for mayor of New York City and later governor, though such sums exceeded state election law limits of $100 per contributor, drawing federal scrutiny amid his racketeering trial. 28. 1. 32. His endorsements extended to local and state races, including support for former mayors Robert F. Wagner Jr. and John V. Lindsay, whom he aided during Lindsay's 1969 re-election bid. as well as Abraham Beame and Frank O'Connor's 1966 gubernatorial campaign. Scotto's political clout secured appointments to city and state advisory roles, such as labor committees under Wagner and Lindsay, enabling him to advocate for waterfront policies favoring longshoremen, including resistance to automation mandates and expansions of the Waterfront Commission. President Carter reportedly considered Scotto for U.S. Secretary of Labor in 1977, reflecting his perceived expertise in labor negotiations, though the nomination never materialized amid emerging allegations of corruption. 14, 28, 29 Through his vice presidency for legislative affairs in the ILA, Scotto lobbied in Washington and Albany for policies preserving union jobs amid containerization shifts, influencing federal discussions on port labor rules in the late 1970s. His alliances with Democratic leaders facilitated informal access to policymakers, though post-conviction evaluations highlighted how such influence often intertwined with unproven organized crime ties, potentially skewing priorities toward insider benefits over broader worker interests. 13. Allegations of organized crime ties. Associations with Gambino family figures. In 1969, the United States Department of Justice identified Anthony Scotto as a captain or caporegime in the Gambino crime family, based on intelligence gathered from informants and surveillance indicating his role in overseeing labor racketeering on the Brooklyn waterfront. 433. This designation stemmed from Scotto's control of International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, Local 1814, which the Gambinos exploited for extortion, loan sharking, and influence over dock operations, with Scotto serving as the family's primary liaison to union activities. 2. Scotto maintained a close association with Gambino family boss Carlo Gambino, who reportedly inducted him into the organization and appointed him to lead waterfront rackets in 1962 after ousting a prior capo. 2. Their relationship afforded Scotto significant autonomy and protection, enabling him to negotiate contracts and allocate jobs in ways that funneled illicit payments to Gambino associates, though Scotto publicly acknowledged only knowing Gambino socially while denying directives from him. 334. Following Gambino's death in 1976, Scotto received continued backing from successor Paul Castellano, who valued his union expertise amid ongoing federal scrutiny of waterfront corruption. 2 wiretaps and investigations later captured Castellano discussing Scotto's operations, underscoring their alliance in sustaining family influence over ILA locals until Scotto's 1978 racketeering indictment disrupted these ties. 3. Control mechanisms on the Brooklyn waterfront. The Brooklyn waterfront, dominated by International Longshoremen's Association ILA, Local 1814 under Anthony Scotto's presidency starting in the early 1960s, operated through entrenched mechanisms that intertwined union authority with organized crime influence to regulate hiring, labor peace, and revenue streams. 1. Central to this was the persistence of modified shape-up practices, despite post-1953 waterfront Commission reforms aimed at curbing daily cash line hiring. Union delegates and peer foremen, often aligned with Gambino family interests via Scotto's familial ties to Anthony Anastasio, retained discretion in assigning work gangs, prioritizing loyalists and extracting unofficial assessments or favors to sustain patronage networks. 35. This system ensured mob-vetted workers dominated employment, limiting access for independents and enforcing discipline through implied threats of blacklisting or violence, as evidenced by historical federal probes into ILA Local's notorious corruption and mafia reputation. 36 employers faced systematic extortion via payoffs for operational predictability, with Scotto and Anastasio convicted in November 1979 of racketeering for accepting over $200,000 and $50,000, respectively, from 1974 to 1978, primarily from trucking and stevedoring firm operators seeking to minimize disruptive fraudulent injury claims. a lucrative racket where union officials colluded with workers to inflate compensation payouts. 6. These cash handoffs, documented through 37 FBI tape recordings and cooperating witness testimony from businessmen like John Montella and Thomas O'Hearn, were framed as insurance against strikes or slowdowns, allowing Scotto to leverage Local 1814's control over 2,000-plus members to guarantee labor stability beneficial to Gambino-aligned peer operators. 6. Such arrangements perpetuated a monopoly on dockside services, where non-compliant firms risked sabotage or exclusion from contracts. Scotto's integration into Gambino networks, as son-in-law to Anastasio, a key waterfront enforcer and relative of mob boss Albert Anastasia, facilitated enforcement through informal arbitration of disputes and loan sharking extensions to indebted workers or operators, embedding criminal oversight into union governance without direct violence in documented cases, but via reputational intimidation. 1. Scotto and co-defendant Anthony Anastasio, Executive Vice President of the International Longshoremen's Association, were convicted on November 16, 1979, after a federal jury in Brooklyn deliberated for 5 days. 6. The jury found Scotto guilty on all 33 counts of the indictment, which charged him with accepting more than $200,000 in illegal cash payoffs from trucking and stevedoring companies between 1972 and 1978 as part of a racketeering pattern under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. 6. 13 evidence presented included testimony from waterfront executives who admitted to making the payments to secure favorable labor contracts and avoid disruptions, corroborated by surveillance and financial records. 6. On February 25, 1981, Scotto was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison by Judge Jacob Mishler, a term described as one of the lighter penalties among over 100 defendants in related waterfront racketeering cases. 43. The sentence reflected convictions for labor racketeering, conspiracy, and related bribery charges, with prosecutors arguing the payoffs undermined union integrity and facilitated organized crime influence. 43. 13. Scotto's appeal, which challenged the RICO convictions on grounds including the sufficiency of predicate acts and jury instructions, was rejected by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in 1981, upholding the verdict. 13. Scotto surrendered to begin serving his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, on July 24, 1981. 24. The conviction led to his removal from union leadership positions, including as president of ILA Local 1814, and barred him from future involvement in longshoremen's activities. 24. Post-conviction period, imprisonment and parole. Scotto commenced serving his 5-year federal prison sentence on July 24, 1981, at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. 24. Under federal guidelines at the time, he became eligible for parole after 1/3 of the term, approximately 20 months. 24. Parole was denied in 1982, requiring Scotto to continue incarceration. 44. He was released on October 9, 1984, after serving about 3 years, with the reduction attributed to good behavior credits that shorten the effective time required. 45. 44. Following release, Scotto faced 5 years of probation as part of the original sentencing structure for subsequent business and philanthropic activities. Following his parole on October 10, 1984, after serving approximately 39 months of a 5-year sentence, Anthony Scotto maintained a low public profile, emphasizing family time and personal interests such as golf. 44. 3. Scotto participated in the family-operated Italian restaurant Fresco by Scotto, situated on East 52nd Street in Manhattan, which endured challenges including a temporary COVID-19-related closure in December 2020 before reopening in June 2021. 46 in philanthropic endeavors. Scotto served as a trustee of the Brooklyn Academy of Music and facilitated free classical music concerts in public parks, reflecting his support for cultural accessibility. 3. Death and evaluations. Final years and passing. After his release from federal prison in October 1984, following a sentence of 5 years for racketeering and extortion convictions, Anthony Scotto adopted a low public profile while engaging in family-oriented business ventures. He contributed to the operations of Fresco by Scotto, an upscale Italian restaurant owned by his family on Manhattan's East Side, where he was occasionally observed in the years following his incarceration. 47 Scotto also participated in local philanthropic efforts and maintained involvement in Brooklyn community politics, though specifics of these activities remained limited in public records. 1. Scotto, born on May 10, 1934, in Red Hook, Brooklyn, lived to the age of 87, outlasting many contemporaries from his Union and Waterfront era. He resided in New York until his death on August 21, 2021. 10. His passing was announced the following day by his daughter, Rosanna Scotto, a co-host on Fox 5 New York's Good Day New York, via an Instagram post expressing family grief and noting him as the beloved husband of Marion Scotto and father to Rosanna, Anthony Jr., John, and Elena. 48-4. Scotto was interred at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn's Greenwood Heights neighborhood. 10. No official cause of death was disclosed in contemporaneous reports. 1. Balanced assessments of legacy. Scotto's tenure as president of ILA Local 1814 from 1963 onward was credited by some observers with fostering a shift toward more professionalized labor relations on the Brooklyn docks, emphasizing negotiated settlements over intimidation and contributing to relative stability amid industry mechanization and job losses. 1. He supported racial integration within union ranks and established initiatives like a medical clinic for members, which addressed health needs in a hazardous work environment. 49. Additionally, Scotto advocated for waterfront redevelopment in Brooklyn, aiming to modernize infrastructure and sustain employment opportunities for longshoremen during a period of containerization-driven decline. 49. However, these efforts were inextricably linked to organized crime influence, with federal authorities designating Scotto a Gambino family captain as early as 1960. 9. And convicting him in 1980 of racketeering for accepting over $200,000 in illicit payoffs from employers between 1972 and 1977. 5. This corruption facilitated mob extraction of tribute from dock operations, perpetuating a pattern of extortion, loan sharking, and violence that eroded worker autonomy and invited intensified government oversight, including Waterfront Commission interventions. 1. Critics, including prosecutors, portrayed him as emblematic of entrenched labor racketeering, where personal enrichment compromised collective bargaining integrity and exposed the union to RICO prosecutions that dismantled corrupt leadership structures. 5. In his later years, Scotto sought to mitigate his tarnished reputation through philanthropy, overseeing a foundation that awarded scholarships to children of ILA members, and low-profile business consulting for unions and firms. 49.5. He also engaged in democratic politics, backing figures like Governor Mario Cuomo, and lectured on labor topics at institutions such as Harvard University. 5. Overall, assessments frame his legacy as dual-natured. A capable administrator who elevated union professionalism and member welfare in tangible ways, yet whose complicity in Mafia dominance exemplified the causal linkage between waterfront prosperity and criminal predation, ultimately prioritizing factional gains over sustainable, ethical labor governance. 1, 5,